"This is counterfeit," the officer said, pinching the bill between his gloved fingers and lifting it toward the blinding afternoon sun, "and it smells like marijuana." Oak Shores, luxury apartment complex, main pool deck. Saturday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the heat radiating off the concrete had pushed well past 115 degrees, the kind of heat that soaks through the soles of your feet and climbs up your legs before you've taken 3 steps out of the shade. The kind that makes the air above the pavement shimmer and twist like a living thing bending the edges of everything you try to look at directly. The pool deck was alive in the way that Saturday afternoons in summer always are, children shrieking as they cannonballed off the side of the pool, the low rhythmic bass of a Bluetooth speaker mounted beneath the canvas awning of the cabana bar thumping steadily beneath the laughter. The mechanical drone of the commercial filtration pumps churning beneath the surface of the turquoise water, the smell of chlorine and sunscreen mixing together in the thick, humid air. At the shallow end of the pool, paddling in slow, easy circles near the tile steps, was a 9-year-old boy named Eli wearing a pair of yellow swim goggles pushed up on his forehead and a wide grin that had been there since he'd arrived 2 hours earlier, because his uncle had promised him the whole afternoon. No interruptions, no phone calls, just the pool, cold water, and whatever he wanted from the bar menu. And right now what Eli wanted most was a bottle of still water and the biggest cup of ice they had, because the sun was absolutely merciless and his throat felt like dry sandpaper. His uncle had climbed out of the pool 5 minutes ago and was walking across the sun-baked aggregate tile toward the cabana bar to get exactly that. Darius Cole was 31 years old and lived in Unit 407, and on that particular Saturday afternoon, he possessed exactly 0 visible markers of authority power or status, and that was entirely by design on a day like this, because all he had wanted was to spend a few uncomplicated hours in the water with his nephew before the week began again. He had just pulled himself out of the pool, and the water was still streaming from his chest down onto the baking aggregate beneath his bare feet, soaking into the concrete and evaporating almost instantly in the punishing heat. His only clothing, a pair of wet navy swim trunks. Nothing else, no shirt, no shoes, no watch, no wallet visible anywhere on his person. Just the compact waterproof silicone pouch he always wore tucked into the waistband of his trunks when he came down to the pool, the kind that cyclists and swimmers use, barely the size of a deck of cards pressed flat against his hip. From the pouch he had retrieved his phone, a slim black device that was, if you looked closely, not quite an ordinary consumer smartphone. Its casing thicker and more angular than most. The kind of ruggedized hardware used by people who needed their devices to keep running in conditions where regular phones would fail, and a single folded $100 bill that was perfectly dry because the pouch had done its job. Darius was not simply a resident of Oak Shores. He was the kind of resident that buildings like this quietly relied on and rarely acknowledged, the person who had spent the past 2 years building a tenant coalition that had successfully pushed back against the complex's management company on 3 separate policy disputes. The man whose number was saved in the phones of dozens of neighbors under titles like Ask Darius or the guy who actually knows the lease. The person who had filed 2 formal written complaints with the property management office about off-duty security personnel treating residents of color differently than white residents at this exact pool deck. Complaints that had been acknowledged with form letters and then quietly buried, and that history sitting invisible beneath the surface of this ordinary Saturday afternoon was about to become relevant in ways that no one standing on that pool deck could yet see. As Darius walked toward the cabana bar, 2 of his neighbors reclining on sun loungers near the diving board lifted their heads and gave him small nods of recognition, the easy acknowledgement of someone they knew and trusted, and Darius nodded back, unhurried his bare feet, finding their way across the hot tile toward the shade of the awning where Tyler was working the bar. Tyler was 22 years old and had been working the weekend shift at the Oak Shores Cabana Bar for going on 3 summers now, and he had developed the particular brand of easy, unhurried competence that comes from doing a job long enough to stop thinking consciously about its individual pieces. He could wipe down the quartz countertop restock, the cooler punch orders into the touchscreen POS terminal, and make conversation all at once without any of it requiring his full attention, which meant that when Darius approached the bar and leaned against the damp edge of the counter, Tyler already had his hand moving toward the cooler before the order was placed. Water and ice. Tyler. Darius said, his voice easy and relaxed, and he unfolded the $100 bill from the waterproof pouch and set it flat on the quartz surface, the paper landing clean and dry and sharp-edged on the damp stone. Every fiber of the cotton-linen blend sitting perfectly flat. The ink crisp and deeply saturated the Federal Reserve seal. A clean, bright green, a bill that had come 25 minutes earlier from the Capital One ATM mounted in the alcove just inside the complex's main gate, dispensed by a machine that had scanned it, authenticated it, and released it with the full confidence of the United States banking system behind it. "Got it," Tyler said, already tapping the order into the screen, and the heavy metal cash drawer beneath the counter kicked open with a sharp mechanical clack that cut briefly through the ambient noise of the pool deck, and Tyler reached forward, his right hand extending across the counter toward the bill. And that was the last, uncomplicated moment of the afternoon. At the far end of the bar, just beyond the shadow line of the canvas awning, where the full weight of the afternoon sun hit the concrete without mercy, Eli had pulled himself halfway up the pool ladder. Yellow goggles on his forehead, watching his uncle across the deck with the uncomplicated contentment of a 9-year-old who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to want, just waiting for the water and the ice, just watching the familiar ritual of his uncle at the bar, just existing in the easy warmth of a Saturday afternoon that had not yet broken. He came from the blind spot, from the deep shadow behind the far corner of the canvas awning, where the angle of the afternoon sun made it genuinely difficult to see anything clearly until it was already standing next to you, and he moved with the quiet, deliberate economy of someone who had spent years approaching situations from angles that gave him maximum advantage before the other person knew what was happening. Officer Raymond Holt was an active-duty municipal patrol officer working an off-duty security detail at Oak Shores, which meant he wore the full tactical uniform of the department. Dark navy from collar to boot, a heavy Kevlar ballistic vest strapped tight across his chest, a Motorola radio on his left shoulder strap, a Glock 17 holstered on his right hip, and a pair of hard-knuckle tactical gloves in black synthetic leather that made his hands look like something built rather than born, and his matte finish mirrored sunglasses reflected the pool deck back at you, in a curved, wide-angle image that told you nothing at all about what was happening behind them. His hair, now visible without a duty cap, was cut close to the skull in the flat, severe style of someone who had carried that discipline from the military into every corner of his civilian life. The blonde faded almost white by the summer sun, and pressed so neat against his scalp that it looked painted on, and his jaw was set with the particular rigidity of a man who had already decided what was happening before he had finished his approach. His right arm shot out with no warning, no announcement of his presence, no verbal command, no professional introduction. Just the flat black palm of his tactical glove slamming down onto the wet quartz surface of the bar with a crack that silenced the nearest 30 feet of pool deck. Instantly, the synthetic leather pinning the $100 bill to the stone exactly half a second before Tyler's fingers could reach it, the impact vibrating the stacked plastic cups near the register and sending a small ripple across the surface of the water glass Tyler had been filling. Tyler froze mid-reach, the blood draining from his face so visibly that it was as though someone had simply switched off a light behind his eyes, his hand hanging in the air over the counter, not touching the money, not pulling back, not doing anything at all. At the edge of the pool, Eli went very still on the ladder. Holt did not look at Tyler, not once, not even for a fraction of a second, because Tyler was not the point. Tyler had never been the point, and everything about the officer's body language made that absolutely clear. From the moment his hand hit the counter, his head tilted slightly downward, his hidden gaze locked entirely on Darius with the kind of fixed, unblinking focus that was not assessment but confirmation. the look of someone who had already reached his conclusion and was now simply proceeding through the steps required to formalize it. He picked the $100 bill up off the counter with two gloved fingers, holding it pinched at the upper corner between his thumb and forefinger, and then he lifted it toward the sky with slow, theatrical deliberateness, letting the harsh white glare of the afternoon sun backlight the paper, illuminating the security thread woven into the cotton-linen blend. And then he began to rub his thumb heavily across the textured denomination in the lower right corner, pressing hard over and over in a motion that mimicked the protocol of a currency examiner, but had none of its precision or purpose, because Holt was not examining anything, he was performing examination. And there is a difference that matters enormously. "Don't ring this up," he said to Tyler, his voice a low, pressurized baritone that moved through the ambient noise of the pool deck without effort and required no repetition, and then, without pausing, without shifting his gaze, without giving Darius a single moment to respond. "It's counterfeit." Darius did not raise his voice, did not step forward, did not make any movement that could be characterized as threatening. He simply kept his bare hands visible at his sides and spoke clearly, calmly, making sure that Tyler heard every word, stating that he had withdrawn that exact bill from the Capital One ATM at the complex's main gate 25 minutes ago, that it was legal tender, and that he would like it returned. Holt did not respond to this because a suspect's verbal explanation carries zero procedural weight against an officer's stated suspicion, and Holt understood the machinery of this situation the way a mechanic understands an engine. He knew exactly which part to turn. He brought the bill to within millimeters of his nose, inhaled sharply through his nostrils with the exaggerated care of a sommelier, and then looked directly down at Darius's bare, wet chest and said, "And it smells like marijuana." Two claims, both entirely subjective, both legally sufficient to establish reasonable suspicion, both delivered in under 10 seconds. The first required no chemical test. The second required no K-9 unit, because under the law, an officer's training and experience are considered adequate to establish both. And Holt had used this combination before in this same complex in situations that had ended the same way without consequence, and he had no reason to believe today would be any different. He folded the bill sharply in half, reached up to the Velcro flap of his breast pocket, and tore it open. The sharp, violent sound of the synthetic fabric separating echoed off the cabana walls like a small explosion, and then he pressed the money inside and sealed the pocket shut, the Velcro catching with a finality that made more than one person on the pool deck flinch. Tyler was still standing behind the counter with his towel clutched in both hands, his knuckles white against the dark fabric, his eyes moving from the officer's pocket to Darius and back again, and saying absolutely nothing. Holt's mirrored sunglasses swept away from Darius's face with the mechanical efficiency of a security camera completing a pan, and his attention locked immediately onto the white plastic sun lounger 10 feet away from the bar, where a black canvas duffel bag sat on the slatted surface, a room key on a blue silicone coil, and a tube of SPF 50 sunscreen resting on top of it. His posture changed, the Kevlar creaking slightly as his broad shoulders angled toward the new target, and he gave the command to step aside, not as a question, not as a request, but as the next item on a procedural checklist that he had already mentally completed before the words left his mouth, his voice carrying the flat, pressurized certainty of someone who was not accustomed to the step being skipped. Darius did not step aside. Instead, he took a single deliberate half-step backward, placing his bare feet wider on the slippery, sun-baked tile to anchor his balance, and then he raised both hands to chest height, palms open and facing outward, fingers spread wide, a posture of such absolute and unmistakable physical compliance that there was no room for any honest person watching to describe it as anything else, and then, in a voice that was controlled and clipped and loud enough to carry to the sun loungers and the pool edge and the row of residents settling into the afternoon around them, he said that he did not consent to any searches of his personal property. The pool deck went quiet. Not the soft quiet of distraction or the gradual quiet of a crowd noticing something, but the sudden dropped quiet of a space in which something important had just been said, and every person present understood it. The Bluetooth speaker's bass line continuing beneath the surface of the silence like a heartbeat that had forgotten to stop. Eli had climbed fully out of the pool now and was standing at the water's edge, feet wet, on the tile-yellow goggles pushed to his forehead, the small cords of his arms hanging at his sides as he looked across the 15 feet of deck that separated him from his uncle and the armored officer. And he was very still in the way that children go still when they sense that the adults around them are navigating something dangerous, not yet understanding the specific nature of the danger, but feeling its shape the way you feel weather coming before you can see the clouds. 3 seconds passed in that silence, 3 full seconds in which neither Darius nor Holt moved, and the only sound was the filtration pumps and the distant laughter of someone in the pool who hadn't noticed yet. Then the muscles in Holt's jaw flexed visibly beneath the skin, and his right hand dropped to his waist and came to rest on the textured polymer grip of his holstered Glock, not drawing, not threatening explicitly, but resting there with a deliberateness that communicated everything it needed to without a single word. Holt gave the commands in succession: turn around, hands behind your head, and Darius obeyed them with the careful, deliberate slowness of a man who understood exactly what was happening and had made the conscious decision that his survival in this moment depended entirely on giving the officer no physical justification for anything. His bare feet pivoting on the slippery tile one at a time, his unprotected back turning toward the armored officer. By degrees, his fingers rising behind his head and lacing together with the visible, undeniable deliberateness of someone making absolutely certain that every person watching could see exactly what his hands were doing. "Am I being detained, officer?" he asked over his shoulder, keeping his voice level and clear. The question precise and legal and exactly the right question to ask. "And what specific crime am I suspected of, He never finished it. Holt crossed the distance in a single explosive stride, and the collision was not subtle or procedural or measured in any way. 240 pounds of Kevlar and duty gear and muscle hit bare wet skin with the full unchecked force of someone who had decided that compliance was not the point, and never had been. Holt's left hand shooting forward and seizing Darius's interlaced fingers and wrenching his arms violently downward and backward, and simultaneously his heavy tactical boot hooked behind Darius's right ankle with the mechanical precision of a technique practiced until it required no conscious thought. Darius's wet feet came out from under him, and he went down hard, unable to catch himself, because his hands were locked behind him, unable to slow the fall. His bare chest and the left side of his face hitting the 115-degree aggregate concrete with a force that drove every molecule of air from his lungs in a single ragged gasp. The scorching stone searing his wet skin, instantly the scrape opening across his cheekbone with a sensation that his nervous system registered as a distant second priority to the shock of the impact itself. Holt dropped his armored weight onto him, a half-second later, knee, driving into the center of Darius's bare spine like a piston pinning him flat, and then the handcuffs ratcheted closed on his wrists with the cold, mechanical efficiency of something designed to be inescapable, tightening into the skin above the joint, the steel warm almost immediately from the heat of the concrete beneath them. Holt leaned forward, pressing his chest against Darius's upper back, his body-mounted camera burying itself into wet skin and plunging the video feed into complete suffocating darkness. The microphone muffled instantly against the pressure, and into this smothered recording he shouted, "Stop! Resisting!" in a voice that carried across the entire pool deck with absolute clarity. A woman screamed from somewhere near the sun loungers, a raw, involuntary sound, the kind that comes before the brain has finished processing what the eyes have seen. Tyler behind the quartz counter had not moved. At the edge of the pool, Eli stepped forward 1 step toward his uncle, and then stopped because a neighbor who had been sitting nearby stood up quickly and put a hand on the boy's shoulder, and Eli stood there in that person's grip with his yellow goggles still on his forehead, and his small hands at his sides watching his uncle's face pressed against the concrete 30 feet away, and he did not make a sound. If you're watching this right now and you're asking yourself how something like this is even possible, stay with us, because what happens next is why this story exists. If stories like this matter to you, take a second to like and subscribe to our channel, because we're just getting started. Holt rose from Darius's back, stepped over his legs with the unhurried efficiency of a man completing a checklist item, and walked directly to the white plastic sun lounger where the black canvas duffel bag was sitting. He did not approach it carefully, did not methodically work through the zippered compartments the way a search conducted with any genuine investigative purpose would require. He simply grabbed the main zipper, ripped it the full length of the bag in a single pull, seized the bottom of the canvas with both gloved hands, and upended it completely over the slatted surface of the lounger, shaking it once to be certain. A rolled white beach towel tumbled out and uncoiled partway across the plastic. A blue tube of sports sunscreen clattered against the slats and spun to a stop. A white iPhone charging cable landed in a tangle. A travel-sized stick of deodorant rolled off the edge of the lounger and hit the concrete. That was all. No stacks of forged bills, no plastic bags. No contraband of any kind. Just the ordinary mundane poolside belongings of a man who had come downstairs on a Saturday afternoon to swim with his nephew and buy a bottle of water. And Holt stood over this collection of unremarkable objects and said nothing. His jaw set. His mirrored sunglasses giving nothing back. The adrenaline of the takedown receding and leaving behind the cold, clear arithmetic of a situation that had gone exactly as far as it could go without anything to show for it. Every person on the pool deck who had witnessed the last 4 minutes was now watching him with the particular quality of attention that has no performance in it. Not the look of people trying to seem like they're watching, but the look of people who cannot look away. From her sun lounger, 5 meters from the bar, Sandra Freeman, 55 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had lived in Oak Shores for 11 years and had seen enough in those 11 years to know exactly what she was looking at, had not moved from her chair since the moment Holt's hand had first hit the counter, and her phone, a modest black device that she had laid flat on her thigh with the casual ease of someone simply resting their hand, had its camera lens oriented precisely toward the bar and had been recording since before the first command was given. Holt walked back to where Darius was lying in a shallow puddle of melting ice and blood, and chlorinated water grabbed his right arm above the elbow with both hands and hauled him to his feet with a single upward jerk. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice flat and uninflected. "Disorderly conduct. Resisting arrest." Darius stood unsteadily on bare feet, blood tracing a slow line down his cheekbone, water dripping from his trunks onto the hot concrete, his hands still cuffed behind him, and he said nothing. Eli tried to take another step forward, and the neighbor's hand tightened gently on his shoulder, and the boy watched his uncle being walked across the pool deck toward the exit gate, and the kicking goggles were still in his hand, and he was squeezing them so hard the silicone frame had gone white at the edges. The municipal precinct squad room was a physical shock after the suffocating heat of the Oak Shores pool deck, the ceiling vents blasting a steady 65 degrees of recycled air that hit Holt's sweat-soaked uniform the moment he came through the interior door, and raised goosebumps on his forearms before he'd crossed the bullpen. The fluorescent tubes overhead casting the flat, shadowless light that makes everything look equally important and equally forgettable. The ambient noise, a low institutional hum of keyboards and radio chatter, and the distant sound of a photocopier cycling through a job somewhere down the corridor. He sat alone at his desk in the corner of the room, the adrenaline of the afternoon completely metabolized, now replaced by the cold mechanical clarity of a man who has done something he now needs to document correctly, and he reached beneath the Velcro flap of his chest pocket and withdrew the folded $100 bill with the careful, practiced motion of someone handling evidence, pulled a heavy-duty clear plastic evidence bag from the wire tray, dropped the bill inside, peeled the tamper seal, pressed it shut, and wrote across the chain of custody label in block letters with a black Sharpie, "Suspected forgery/narcotics investigation." Then he opened the department's records management system, positioned the keyboard in front of him, and began to construct the version of the afternoon that he needed the world to believe. He did not think of it as lying. This was the part that mattered, the part that explained everything. The reason he could do it at all, because Holt had been doing this long enough that the gap between what happened and what he wrote had become in his mind not a moral problem, but a translation problem. The challenge of rendering the intuitive knowledge of a trained officer into the specific legal vocabulary that judges and prosecutors required, and he believed in the way that people believe things they have never been forced to examine that his instincts had been correct, and that the report was simply the formal confirmation of a truth he already knew. His fingers moved across the keys with steady professional rhythm. Upon initiating a lawful investigatory detention regarding the suspected passing of counterfeit currency, the subject became immediately verbally hostile and visibly agitated, bladed his body toward this officer, clenched both hands into fists in a recognized pre-assaultive posture, immediate articulable threat to officer safety, standard tactical leg sweep to gain compliance. He read it back, once moved his cursor to the signature checkbox and clicked. The progress bar crossed the screen and the document uploaded to the municipal server, and what had begun as a man buying a bottle of water for a 9-year-old in a swimming pool was now a sworn official government record. This chapter belongs entirely to Eli. A neighbor from the 6th floor, a woman named Patricia, who had known Darius for 2 years and had his sister's number already in her phone by the time she reached the elevator, rode down with Eli in silence, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder without gripping, and Eli stood looking at his reflection in the polished metal elevator doors, the whole way up, his yellow goggles still looped around his wrist, his feet leaving small damp prints on the elevator floor that faded before the doors opened. He sat at the kitchen table while Patricia made the call, and he watched the back of Patricia's shoulders while she spoke quietly into the phone, and he saw the exact moment the shoulders tightened, a small, involuntary contraction that lasted less than 2 seconds, and then was controlled, managed, pushed back down, and he was 9 years old, but he understood that what her shoulders had just done meant that whatever was happening to Uncle Darius was not a simple misunderstanding that would be resolved in 20 minutes. His mother came home 40 minutes later, and she sat with him, and she answered his questions in the careful, measured way that parents answer questions when they are trying to give their child the truth without giving them the weight of it all at once. And Eli listened to all of it, and then asked the one question he had been holding since the moment he watched his uncle's face hit the concrete. Why didn't the man stop when Uncle Darius said, "Please"? His mother did not answer immediately, and the silence in the kitchen was very full. Eli placed his yellow goggles on the table very carefully, perfectly centered on the placemat, in the precise and deliberate way that children arrange small objects when they are trying to impose order on something they cannot control. And then he went to the window and looked down at the pool deck below the water. Still and turquoise in the late afternoon light, the sun loungers empty. Now the cabana bar shuttered the concrete dry and innocent-looking in the long golden shadows of early evening, giving back nothing of what it had held 4 hours before. Nathaniel Cross had been practicing civil rights law for 18 years from the same downtown office, and in that time he had developed a particular method of reading police reports that had less in common with legal analysis than with the work of someone disassembling a machine to find where the fabrication entered the supply chain. He read slowly marked nothing on the first pass and waited for the document to show him the load-bearing wall, the single claim upon which everything else depended. Because in his experience there was always one, and the cases that ended badly for his clients were almost always the cases where that wall had been correctly identified too late. He read Officer Raymond Holt's incident report twice without touching his pen, then looked at the booking photograph of his client. The bruise along Darius Cole's cheekbone already deepening to purple in the fluorescent light of the processing room, the sealed laceration visible against his skin, and then he went back to the report and read it a third time. He ignored the marijuana claim entirely because scent is vapor, and vapor cannot be measured or preserved or placed before a jury as a physical object, and Holt knew that when he made the claim, and Cross knew it now, it was a decoration on the report, not a foundation, and foundations were what mattered. The foundation was the $100 bill. Every other element of the encounter, the detention, the refusal to consent the use of force, the arrest itself was legally predicated on Holt's sworn assertion that his training and experience had identified that bill as counterfeit at the moment of seizure, which meant that if the bill was real, the seizure was an unconstitutional act, and if the seizure was unconstitutional, then everything the officer had done in the moments following it had been built on poisoned ground. The search, the use of force, the arrest, the charges, all of it potentially invalidated by a single demonstrably false claim. Cross did not call the precinct. He did not contact the department's internal affairs division. He opened his drafting software and began composing a subpoena dutis tecum, addressed to the Legal Compliance Department of Capital One Financial Corporation, demanding the complete internal diagnostic logs for the specific ATM unit located at the main entrance of Oak Shores Luxury Apartment Complex for the specific date and time window beginning at 1:15 and ending at 1:50 on the afternoon in question. He sent it the same evening. The encrypted file arrived from Capital One's Compliance Division 3 days later, and Cross opened it at his desk in the early morning, before the rest of the office had come in the 2 monitors in front of him, throwing the only light in the room. The building quiet around him, in the way that buildings are quiet before the day has properly started, and the world hasn't yet applied its full weight to things. He pulled up the police evidence log on the left monitor and found the chain of custody entry Holt had completed the afternoon of the arrest, the one where the officer had meticulously recorded, as required by department protocol, the serial number of the confiscated bill he had logged as suspected counterfeit currency MB4471823C. He opened the Capital One ATM diagnostic log on the right monitor and scrolled to the timestamp that corresponded to 25 minutes before Holt's first contact with Darius Cole at the bar. And there it was printed in the flat, indifferent typography of a banking system that processes thousands of transactions per hour and keeps records of every one of them, with the same absolute impartiality it applies to all the others. Dispense $100. Routing Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Serial MB4471823C. Cross sat with those 2 monitors for a long moment, not moving the numbers on the left screen and the numbers on the right screen saying the same thing in the same order with the same letter, and the silence in the office was very complete. The bill was not counterfeit. The bill had never been counterfeit. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York had issued it, the Capital One ATM had authenticated it, logged it, and dispensed it to Darius Cole at 1:37 in the afternoon, and 25 minutes later, Raymond Holt had taken it off a bar counter, put it in his pocket, and filed a sworn government document declaring it to be a forgery. What Holt had done on that pool deck was not an error in judgment, was not a mistaken identification, was not an officer acting on flawed but genuine suspicion. It was a seizure of authenticated legal tender from a citizen who was buying a bottle of water, conducted under false pretense and recorded as official fact, and the federal banking record sitting on the right-hand monitor made that impossible to argue around. Cross printed the log, the laser printer warming and cycling in the quiet office, and while it ran, he opened his email and sent a message to a private investigator he worked with regularly, asking for a canvass of the Oak Shores pool deck area and a door-to-door inquiry among residents who might have been present that Saturday afternoon, because the banking log had given him the first wall to knock down, and he already knew from experience that one wall was never enough. Within 48 hours, the investigator called him back with a name. Sandra Freeman, Unit 601, retired schoolteacher, 11 years in the building, and she had her phone with her the whole time. Sandra Freeman had not immediately decided to share the video, and it would be dishonest to the complexity of what she had lived through to suggest that her hesitation was simple cowardice, because it was not. It was the entirely rational caution of a woman who had spent 55 years learning lesson by lesson and incident by incident that evidence in the hands of the right people changes everything, and evidence in the hands of the wrong people disappears. And she had no way of knowing yet which kind of hands were reaching toward her. She had kept the file on her phone, backed it up to her cloud storage the same night, and then sat with it for 4 days, telling no one, going about her life with the weight of it present, somewhere beneath everything she did. The Tuesday morning when she went to the farmer's market, the Wednesday evening when she called her daughter in Atlanta, the Thursday afternoon when she sat on her balcony with a glass of iced tea and watched the pool deck below, with the particular attention of someone who is still processing something they witnessed. What moved her in the end was not a legal calculation or a theory about evidence, it was Eli. She had seen the boy standing at the water's edge with his goggles in his hand, and she had watched the exact moment he tried to walk toward his uncle and was gently held back, and she had seen his face in the seconds after the particular expression of a child who is being protected from something and knows it, and cannot do anything with that knowledge except carry it, and that image had stayed with her through the farmer's market and the phone call and the iced tea on the balcony, settling deeper every day, rather than fading the way the memory of other difficult things eventually fades. In the days following the incident, she had knocked on the door of Darius's sister's apartment once to bring food, once simply to check in, and on the second visit, she had sat at the kitchen table with Eli for 20 minutes, while the adults spoke in the other room, and the boy had told her in the measured, precise way that children describe traumatic things when they have decided to trust the adult. They are talking to exactly what he had seen from the edge of the pool, the detail and the sequence of it sitting in his memory with perfect clarity undimmed. When the private investigator knocked on her door, Sandra Freeman answered it, listened to the explanation of who had sent him and why, and said she needed to think overnight. The next morning she called Nathaniel Cross directly and transferred the raw MP4 file to his secure server on the single condition of anonymity, which he granted without hesitation. Cross opened the file at his desk and let it run from the beginning, watching the pool deck materialize on his screen in the vertical 4K format of a phone camera held casually on a thigh. The angle from Sandra's lounger gave him a clean profile view of the bar from approximately 5 meters, the kind of angle that Holt's chest-mounted camera pressed face down into Darius's wet shoulder at the moment of the takedown had been structurally incapable of capturing. He watched Holt approach, watched the hand slam down on the counter, watched the theatrical performance with the bill under the sun, watched Darius raise his hands and state his refusal with complete clarity. The audio clean enough through the pool noise that the words were unmistakable, every syllable recorded with the unambiguous fidelity of a microphone that was 6 feet from the speaker and aimed directly at him. He let it run until the moment before the takedown and then pressed the space bar and the image froze. Darius's back was to the camera, his bare feet planted on the tile, his arms raised, his fingers interlaced behind his head, a posture of such total and visible compliance that it was not a matter of interpretation or angle or framing. It was simply what was there, recorded by a retired school teacher's phone on a Saturday afternoon, with no agenda other than the instinct of a woman who had seen enough to know when to press record. Cross looked at the frozen frame for a long time. Then he looked at the sentence in Holt's sworn report, bladed his body toward this officer, and clenched both hands into fists in a recognized pre-assaultive posture. And he looked back at the screen, at the interlaced fingers, at the open palms, at the back, turned deliberately and fully away from the officer in the posture of a man trying to demonstrate with his entire body that he was not a threat. There was no bladed stance. There were no clenched fists. There was nothing in the frozen image that corresponded to a single word of the paragraph Holt had signed under penalty of perjury, and Cross had now seen a great many things in 18 years of this work. But this particular combination, the banking record on one screen and the video on another, was the most complete dismantling of a false arrest report he had encountered in a long time. He closed the video player, opened his firm's legal drafting software, and began writing the formal notice of civil deposition compelling Officer Raymond Holt to appear and give sworn testimony. The conference room at Cross's firm had thick glass walls and a door that sealed with a soft, pressurized click that left the interior feeling genuinely separate from the rest of the building. The ambient noise of the office dropping away the moment it closed, leaving only the quiet of a room that had been specifically designed for conversations that required the full weight of legal consequence behind every word spoken in it. Holt sat across the wide mahogany table from Cross in a gray suit that fit him poorly in the way that suits fit people who have spent their adult lives in uniforms. The shoulders slightly off the collar of the shirt, sitting a quarter-inch too high. Everything technically correct and somehow slightly wrong, like a translation that has captured all the words but missed the rhythm, and without the Kevlar and the duty belt and the tactical gloves and the mirrored sunglasses. Without the weight and the architecture of the uniform that had defined every interaction he'd had in his professional life for the past 12 years. He looked like what he was, a man in his late 30s, sitting at a table in a room where someone was about to ask him questions he had not prepared honest answers for. His union attorney sat to his right with his chair pushed back slightly from the table, projecting the relaxed, slightly bored confidence of someone who had been through dozens of these depositions and found them as a category largely uneventful. Fishing expeditions, in his experience, run by plaintiffs' attorneys looking for settlements, and the qualified immunity doctrine made the fishing difficult, and most of these things ended in modest numbers and non-disclosures, and there was nothing about this particular file that had suggested to him it would be different. The court reporter sat at the end of the table, fingers poised over the stenotype machine waiting. Cross opened without preamble, confirmed that Holt had authored the incident and arrest report, filed following the arrest of Darius Cole, confirmed that he had read it before signing, confirmed that he had signed it electronically under penalty of perjury. Then he walked through the report paragraph by paragraph, and Holt answered each point with the measured, practiced confidence of an officer who has given testimony. Before deliberate pace, precise language, building the courtroom cadence that transforms a man's account of his own actions into something that sounds structurally different from an ordinary story, something that sounds official, trained-earned. When Cross reached the line about the identification of the currency, Holt stated that the paper felt wrong, inconsistent texture, wrong weight in the hand, and Cross nodded as if filing the information and moved forward, and Holt settled slightly deeper into his posture, and the union attorney's expression remained neutral and slightly bored. Cross reached into the leather briefcase beside his chair, removed a single printed page, and slid it across the mahogany surface face up, and without comment until it had cleared the center of the table. "Exhibit A," he said for the record. "Certified diagnostic log subpoenaed directly from Capital One Financial. Time-stamped 25 minutes prior to your interaction with Mr. Cole. Please read the serial number of the dispensed bill aloud." Holt looked down at the document, and his union attorney leaned in from the right to read it simultaneously, and there was a brief pause in the room, not a long pause, perhaps 2 seconds. And then Holt read the number, MB 4471823C. His voice had lost something between the previous sentence and this one, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to someone who hadn't been paying attention, but Cross had been paying attention to exactly this, and the fraction of volume that had disappeared from Holt's voice was the sound of a man encountering something he had not expected to encounter. "That is a perfect alphanumeric match," Cross said, his own voice entirely flat to the serial number you entered into the departmental evidence log as suspected counterfeit currency. He paused one beat, then added, "The bill. Your training and experience identified as a forgery was issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and authenticated by Capital One's internal scanning system 25 minutes before you took it off the bar counter." Holt shifted in his chair. Counterfeits occasionally enter ATM systems. It's not unheard of. Cross did not respond to this. He reached to his left and turned a slim silver laptop until its screen faced the center of the table, angled so that Holt and his attorney both had an unobstructed view, and he pressed the spacebar. The pool deck filled the screen, the ambient hum of the filtration pumps audible through the laptop's speakers, the afternoon light glinting off the water in the background, the quartz bar surface catching the sun, and then Darius's voice came through. Clearly, I do not consent to any searches of my personal property. Cross pressed the spacebar again. The image froze. On the screen, in high-definition clarity, Darius Cole stood with his back to the camera, his bare feet on the tile, his arms raised, his fingers interlaced behind his head, hands open palms visible. Not a single finger curled toward a fist, not a single element of the posture that Holt had described under oath anywhere in the frame. The stenotype machine stopped. The silence in the room was of a quality that Cross had only encountered a handful of times in 18 years, the specific silence of a moment in which a lie sworn before God and the legal system and the permanent record has been placed next to the truth it was meant to replace, and there is nothing left for anyone in the room to say that would change what the comparison shows. Officer Holt Cross said quietly, pushing the laptop an inch closer across the table. Please point to the clenched fists you stated under oath that you observed before you drove Mr. Cole face first into the concrete. The union attorney's hand came down over Holt's microphone. 10 seconds of fierce, barely audible whispering. Holt looked at the screen for a long moment. Not at Cross, not at his attorney, not at the court reporter. Just at the image at his own lie, illuminated in 4,800 pixels on a mahogany table in an air-conditioned room surrounded by people who would all remember this for the rest of their professional lives. Then he straightened in his chair, turned to face the court reporter, and said in a voice that had lost every trace of the courtroom cadence, "On the advice of counsel, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." 7 days after the deposition, the city's risk management department authorized a wire transfer of $2.4 million to Nathaniel Cross's client trust account. Not because anyone in the municipal government had experienced a sudden conversion of conscience, but because the city's own legal team had reviewed the two exhibits and reached the same conclusion that Cross had reached 3 weeks earlier at his desk in the early morning light, which was that there was no version of this case that ended well for the city at trial, and the cost of losing at trial was considerably higher than the cost of settling before one. Officer Raymond Holt was stripped of his qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that had protected him from personal liability for years of decisions made in the field, and was terminated from the department within the same week. The separation conducted through an administrative process that required no public hearing and generated no press release, just paperwork filed and a badge and a service weapon returned to a desk sergeant on a Tuesday morning. His name was submitted to the Brady List, the permanent, publicly accessible registry, maintained for the use of prosecutors across the country documenting law enforcement officers who have been found to have committed acts of dishonesty or perjury in their official capacity, meaning that any future testimony Holt gave in any courtroom in any jurisdiction could be challenged on the basis of this record, meaning that his value as a witness in any legal proceeding was permanently and irrevocably compromised, meaning that whatever he had protected by filing that report on the afternoon of the arrest, he had paid for it with the entirety of what remained. The envelope containing his termination notice was delivered to his home address on a Wednesday, and Holt sat at his kitchen table with it for a long time after opening it, the Kevlar hanging on its hook by the door, the duty belt on the shelf above it, the uniform pressed and ready in the closet out of habit, and for the first time in 12 years, he sat in his own kitchen in civilian clothes on a weekday morning with nowhere to be and nothing to represent. And the weight of that was different from anything he had anticipated, because he had believed somewhere beneath all of it that he had been right. And now there was nothing left to hide that belief behind. 3 weeks after the settlement was announced on a Thursday evening in late August, when the heat had finally broken, and the sky over the neighborhood had the particular deep blue of the first genuinely cool evening. After a long summer, Raymond Holt was walking along the sidewalk 2 blocks from Oak Shores, not because he had a reason to be there exactly, but because he had been walking a lot in those weeks, the kind of purposeless walking that fills the hours that used to be filled with a schedule when he heard the sound of bicycle wheels on concrete and looked up. Eli came around the corner first, pedaling easily on a red bike with a basket attached to the handlebars, his yellow swim goggles hanging from the basket by one strap, and a friend slightly behind him on a green bike, and Eli looked up from the sidewalk ahead of him and saw the man standing on the pavement, and he recognized him. Children do not forget faces the way adults sometimes convince themselves they do, and Eli stopped his bike without making a production of it, setting one foot down on the sidewalk and looking at Holt with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a child who has not yet learned to look at difficult things sideways. There was no accusation in the look, no performance of anger, no rehearsed expression, just the eyes of a 9-year-old who had seen something that had not left him looking at the man who had put it there with all the directness and all the weight of someone who simply had not found a way yet to put it down. Holt looked back at him, and in the 10 or 15 seconds that they held each other's gaze on that sidewalk in the cooling August evening, something happened to Raymond Holt that had not happened in the conference room or the administrative office or the kitchen. With the termination notice he saw for the first time not the pool deck, and not the report, and not the deposition, but the 9-year-old standing at the edge of the pool with his goggles in his hand, trying to walk toward his uncle and being gently held back, and the expression on that child's face, and the fact that the child was still carrying it, and the further fact that he, Raymond Holt, had put it there, and there was no legal doctrine, and no qualified immunity, and no courtroom cadence that covered the distance between those two things. Eli pushed off from the sidewalk and pedaled away without saying anything, his friend falling in beside him, the two of them rounding the next corner and disappearing, the sound of the wheels fading. Holt stood on the sidewalk alone for a while, and then he kept walking, and the evening was very quiet. 6 months after the afternoon that changed everything, Oak Shores luxury apartment complex main pool deck, Saturday, 2 o'clock, and the heat was back pressing down on the concrete with the same relentless weight it had carried the year before, the filtration pumps running the Bluetooth speaker, thumping its low bass line beneath the laughter, everything outwardly identical and inwardly entirely different. Darius Cole walked out of the elevator and across the sun-warmed tile toward the cabana bar, wearing the same navy swim trunks, feet bare on the aggregate, the thin, pale line of a healed scar sitting high on his cheekbone, like a very faint parenthesis around everything the past 6 months had contained, and on his left wrist, a matte black smartwatch that he raised toward the payment terminal on Tyler's counter with a single easy motion, the quiet ping of a completed transaction replacing the crinkle of paper currency. No bill to examine, no fiber to rub, no probable cause left anywhere in the transaction for anyone to manufacture from nothing. Tyler set the water and the ice on the counter with the particular care of a man trying to say something that doesn't have words yet, and Darius picked them up and turned toward the pool where Eli was already in the water goggles on arms, windmilling through a lap with the focused intensity of a boy who has decided this summer he is going to get fast. The city had changed its policy 2 months after the settlement. Off-duty officers working private security details were prohibited from executing property seizures without either a warrant or a supervising officer present. The kind of rule that gets written only after the cost of not having it has been paid in full, and the citation in the policy document referenced the Cole case by name. Sandra Freeman had never spoken publicly about the video she recorded, and she had not wanted to, and that had been respected. But at her request, a portion of the settlement funds had been directed through a foundation. Cross helped establish into a scholarship program for students at the elementary school, where she had taught for 22 years, and the first 3 recipients had been announced the previous month. Their names read at a small ceremony in the school's gymnasium that Sandra had attended, and left before the photographs were taken. because the recognition had never been the point for her, and it still wasn't. Nathaniel Cross had taken 4 additional cases in the months since different cities, different officers, different circumstances, and the same essential shape underneath all of them. The same pattern of authority used as a weapon against people who had no visible power to push back with, and in each of those cases, the first thing he did after reading the police report was open 2 browser windows side by side and start looking for the load-bearing wall, because in his experience there was always one. At the edge of the pool, Eli finished his lap, pulled his goggles up to his forehead, and looked across the water at his uncle sitting in the shade with a cold water and a calm expression, and the unhurried ease of a man who has been through something and come out the other side of it, still himself, and Eli called out something across the water. Some 9-year-old question about whether his time was fast, and Darius checked his watch with theatrical seriousness and gave a thumbs up, and the boy laughed and pushed off from the wall and went again, arms churning goggles down the water, parting around him and closing behind him, the way water does, as though nothing had ever disturbed it, as though the surface had always been this still, and Darius watched him go and finished his water, and sat in the shade of a Saturday afternoon that was for the first time in 6 months simply what it appeared to be.